Alright, so welcome back to the reinstallation portion of the ZHP clutch job. First things first, align the dowel pin on your crankshaft with the hole in the flywheel and then start bolting it in. As you can see, I ended up wedging a long pry bar into one of the teeth of the flywheel, and that helped me brace the flywheel from turning as I'm torquing everything together. It's a little bit janky, but it works. Next up, I cleaned the flywheel really well to get rid of the anti-rust coating that they shipped that flywheel with. Then I throw on the clutch, making sure the flywheel side of the disc faces the flywheel. And lastly, I throw on the pressure plate, aligning the dowels of the flywheel to the holes on the pressure plate. Since I'm reusing the pressure plate bolts, I decided to put some blue Loctite on them before torquing them down. And lastly, the clutch alignment tool provided by ClutchMax in this kit worked perfectly for reinstallation. Now we move on to fixing the leaks on the transmission. Off camera, I pried off the old shift selector shaft seal, and I'm just driving a new one in with a 15mm deep socket. Next, I drive a wood screw through the input shaft seal and then pry it out with a pair of long pliers. Be sure you don't drive that screw in too deep and puncture the dust shield on the input shaft bearing, but it's not the end of the world if you do. And for reinstallation, I just drive that seal in flush with a soft handle of some sort. For the guide tube, I once again used some blue Loctite for the bolts. And for the pivot pin, I heated up the transmission case and froze the pivot pin itself and just knocked it in with a 14mm socket. I purchased a new clutch fork, lubed that up, lubed up the input shaft, lubed up the pivot pin, and also lubed up the throwout bearing. You want to use your moly lube very sparingly because you don't want any of this to fling around in your transmission bell housing and get onto the clutch material, because that's going to guarantee that your transmission is going to start slipping again. But once all this is done, we're ready to throw the transmission back onto the car. One thing I forgot to mention when dropping the transmission is that I lowered the front subframe about 3/4 of an inch just so I can get better access to the top 3 bolts. I left it hanging a little bit lower, so on reinstallation it was also pretty easy and I had plenty of room to work with.
And well, there you have it. I struggled a little bit aligning the transmission to go in, but with the help of the jack and being able to pivot both left, right, and then forwards and backwards, got it in. The key is to not make it hang on the input shaft, so really just use the jack as much as possible, and then when you just get to shove in properly, it goes in easy as pie. I left the transmission in gear so then I can spin this output shaft right here, and that helps me align the input shaft with the clutch splines. So that helped out a lot. And then once that input shaft stops spinning, you know that you're into the clutch shaft. And there was about a 1/4 inch that I couldn't get all the way in, so then I know you're not supposed to do this, but I used the bolts, the transmission like bell housing bolts, to drive it the rest of the way in. Don't be like me and forget to add on the selector shaft joint. So do that, because it is slightly annoying to do it underneath the car again, but with the transmission jack down like this, you get way more room to work. So the next thing I'm going to do is put the carrier on, and then align the shift lever, throw that bushing in on the back. I've already torqued everything. That's pretty boring, and I think it's like 44 foot-pounds for the big bolts, 33 for the starter, and then 14 for the ones that attach to the oil pan. Pretty simple, pretty basic. I would say it probably took me like a good hour trying to align everything and put the bolts back in properly. The starter also gave me a bunch of pain because the dowel pin is super annoying. So yeah, good luck with that when you're also doing this project. A little bit of lube goes a long way on that dowel pin. I don't know what else to tell you. Again, I know you're not supposed to do this, but I started using the bolts to help pull in the starter all the way. And yeah, be ready for a lot of cursing, swearing, and just general annoyance.
For the shifter carrier, I put on new rubber bushings. You see me using the eBay B&M short shifter, but I actually found out that didn't work and I had to revert back to the original worn out shift lever, and I'm going to figure out the shifter at some point in the future. Next up, we put on the slave cylinder, then we move on to the Guibo or flex disc. I found out that because the engine and transmission has been dropped so much, I couldn't fully torque down the drive shaft to the Guibo. So what comes next is me retorquing the front subframe and getting everything secure that way, and then we can move back, put on the transmission brace, and then finally put on the Guibo. Lastly, we've reinstalled the center support bearing, keeping mine to preloaded to the front of the car, and we're finally done with everything underneath. One thing that I noticed when I was doing the intake manifold gaskets was that the intake boots were starting to crack, so I took this opportunity while the car was down to get those things knocked out of the way. And then I went to the interior of the car and also knocked out the clutch pedal bushings with new OEM ones because they were pretty sloppy after 225,000 miles. Doing the clutch pedal bushings was pretty easy once the footwell panel was off. I removed the spring, unbolted the clutch master cylinder, popped off a clip, and then just slid the entire pedal assembly off its standoff. Then I just threw on the new bushings and just reassembled everything. And now to test if the wheels spin. Well, there you have it, folks. Both the forward and reverse gears spin the wheels. So now we move on to the last part of this project, brake hoses. One thing I like to do when working on brake lines is put a block of wood on the brake pedal so that when you break a line loose, you don't have too much fluid loss. I used a 7/16 crow's foot wrench on the hardline side and a 14mm crow's foot wrench on the caliper side, and overall this was a very straightforward project. Don't forget to bleed your brakes after this job. Off camera, I used my trusty Mighty Vac and did a vacuum bleed, and that just about sums up this video. As a parting gift, here's a shot of how badly my front brake lines were cracked and how dangerous it would have been if I had actually taken this car on the track. Well, there you have it. Thank you guys for watching and stay tuned for more ZHP updates.